Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? If you give me your full attention, I'll tell you where you can get the drinks later. My name is Frank Delaney. I have the honor and the pleasure of being your facilitator here this afternoon at the opening of what should be an absolutely marvelously interesting weekend in Kent, Connecticut. My wife Diane and I live here in Kent. It's a place to which we are completely devoted. It's a very warm-hearted, spirited community. And those of you who haven't been here before, I think you'll enjoy it. It's full of interesting people. We have everything from Broadway producers to quiet war heroes, marvelous designers, and terrific food, by the way. So you should have a good time. But better than that is what's going to happen this weekend. We now have reason to be even more proud of this little jewel in the crown of Litchfield County. Because what you're going to see over the next few days has been designed, curated, organized, managed, and dreamed up by two distinguished citizens of Kent, and, it has to be said, distinguished citizens of the United States, whom I will now welcome to the platform. Please give a very warm welcome to Ben and Donna Rosen.
Okay. If y'all clap anymore, I'm going to start singing. So just stop. So we're going to get teary. I think you know that. Thank you all so much. For those of you who live close, those that you live who live far away, to come and be with us launching this is a very special moment in our lives. The speakers, I don't even know what to say. They're just so dazzling. We're all in for such a big treat. But for my really good friends that have wondered why they haven't seen or heard anything from me for the last year, I think you can look around and have a pretty good idea of what we've been doing. But I love all of you, and I'm just glad you're here and eager to meet those of you whom I don't know. Thank you.
I'd like to correct one item that's in the program that's in your registration kit. It alleges that this all started a year ago when Donna and I were sipping a cool summer drink. It was after the second martini that we got this cockamamie idea to do what we're trying to do. We couldn't have done it without the most generous speakers who are coming here, all the people that have helped us, Dick Shell and his Kent School, which have donated this facility to us for the event, and their staff that's been so helpful. We're putting on an Ideas Festival for 2.5 days, where 70-odd speakers are going to be presenting in 38 sessions, and 300 of you have chosen to come here from so far. We appreciate that. We're trying to make it special, and rather than tell you how good it's going to be, we'll let you decide that when it's over. I want to join Donna in thanking you for coming, and now I'm going to turn it back to our Major D, our maestro, our resident of Kent with a native Kent accent, Frank Delaney.
And I want to just add a gloss to something Ben Rosen said. It's terrible to be pedantic, but he did say 70-odd speakers. You heard him, didn't you? Didn't he say 70-odd speakers? You're going to hear quite a few of them this afternoon. Let us, though, begin now, our first plenary session. Let us begin, as we mean to continue, at a very, very high level of thought and conversation. Here's the first session. in which a renowned American diplomat takes part in a conversation with a renowned American journalist. One of them has had a 33-year-long career as a diplomat, embassies in Russia, Jordan, Deputy Secretary of State, and it was said of him that his gift of written communication was as elegant and shapely as his diplomacy was discreet and effective. His distinguished interlocutor this afternoon is the New York Times national security correspondent. Please would you welcome Ambassador William Barnes and David Sanger. I'll shout. There will be room for questions at the end.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, for getting all of this organized, and thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be on stage here with Bill Burns, who I have to say, in the many years I've covered diplomacy and so forth, he is the model of what you would want to see in an American diplomat. You've all read the biography, how he worked for Jim Baker, worked for Colin Powell, how he handled our Middle East negotiations for many years. That went really well, didn't it, Bill? Ambassador to Russia. I remember one evening when I was in Moscow with just a hilarious night at Spaso House, dinner with Bill as he was trying to describe what they were trying to get done with Vladimir Putin. He came back to Washington as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and then as Deputy Secretary of State, which is one of the most trying, though fascinating jobs in Washington. One story about Bill, because I thought it characterized, I got a glimpse briefly of why it was that diplomats around the world wanted to go deal with him. In November of 2010, the New York Times had been going through, I had been going through with my colleagues for 4 or 5 months, the WikiLeaks documents. We had gotten them in August and were convinced that the United States government was highly aware that we had all of these. It turned out they were clueless that we had these, but you know, that's all right. And we were going through 250,000 State Department cables that largely, as Bill and I have later agreed, showed that American diplomats, shockingly, were doing what they said they were doing. But there were many interesting and fascinating stories there. And the week of Thanksgiving 2010, we went over to the White House and explained what we had. And we had guessed sort of 24 hours of sort of shock setting in before they tried to persuade us not to print them. Instead, it was 48. And the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving of 2010, when everybody was trying to get out of town, we got summoned to what we were told was going to be a meeting of 3 or 4 people at the State Department who wanted to discuss our imminent publication that weekend of these documents. And we walked in the room, and there were 40 people in the room. And as we introduced ourselves to them, most of them would not tell us their names as they were sitting in the back. They worked for other agencies in the State Department. And we sat down and got the opening position of the State Department, which was, you can't publish any of these. And we told them that ship had already left. And then you can't publish any of them that have foreign names in them. And we said, turned out the State Department dealt with a lot of foreigners. Who knew? And the conversation was sort of going downhill from there. And the door opens after about an hour and a half of this, and in walks Bill. And I'm sitting there thinking, thank goodness somebody has actually finally showed up with whom we're going to be able to go deal with this. And in fact, Bill and my colleagues ended up having some conversations over the next few days in which he laid out practically, in very practical terms, what would truly be damaging, names of people, things that could get people injured or killed, and what really wasn't going to be all that damaging. And we ended up publishing the material, and it turned out the world went on, and diplomacy did not end for the United States, as it was told. And I just always remember that moment with Bill, because we were on a collision course with the U.S. government, and Bill made it a non-collision. So that was an example of Bill at work. We thought we'd start off today with a discussion, just to start the discussion off with the Iran debates. We'll be having more on this tomorrow, but Bill, if you didn't know it, was one of 2 Americans who started the secret diplomacy with Iran that led to these negotiations. And let me just start off, Bill, by asking, how does the outcome of this compare to what you had envisioned when you first went off to see Javad Zarif and other Iranians in 2013?
Well, thanks, and it's really a pleasure to be here this evening, and thanks to Ben and Donna Rosen, and it's an honor to be on the stage with David. On the Iran talks, the secret talks began at the beginning of March of 2013, and if you go back to the beginning of President Obama's second term, we had built up a considerable amount of leverage against the Iranians through sanctions that really began to bite on Iran, sanctions that were the product of working with a number of important international partners. Iran's oil exports had declined by 50%, the value of its currency had declined by 50%, and so we thought this was the right time to test whether or not they'd be serious about negotiations. President Obama, I think, rightly decided at the time, given 35 years in which we had had no sustained direct engagement with the Iranians, that the best way to do this was quietly, given the amount of political baggage on both sides. So the Omani government, which is a discrete leadership, had offered to try to facilitate these kind of conversations. And so we met in a variety of secluded places in Oman. And I started off quite skeptical in those secret talks that you could ever get to the point of producing a comprehensive agreement. But after the election of President Rouhani and Javad Zarif becoming the Iranian foreign minister, it became clear, this is in summer of 2013, that the Iranians were interested seriously in trying to develop a negotiated nuclear agreement. And so what we produced coming out of those quiet talks was an interim agreement, which was bitterly criticized at the time when it was announced in November of 2013, but actually turned out to be a pretty solid foundation for the comprehensive talks. We froze the Iranian nuclear program at that time, rolled it back in some important respects, introduced some very intrusive inspection procedures, which we then built on in the comprehensive talks, and all in return for very modest sanctions relief. So we preserved the leverage on the Iranians for the comprehensive talks. And as I said, there was bitter criticism at the time. I remember Prime Minister Netanyahu, the day the agreement was announced, said this was the deal of the century for Iran. I remember showing that headline to my Iranian counterpart and saying that this should make your selling job in Tehran a little bit easier. I remember another moment in those secret talks when probably one of the highlights of my checkered career as an American diplomat, when one of my Iranian counterparts accused me of being a rug merchant, which as I said, was high praise in that context. But to answer your question, David, I think, we understood at the time that these talks were going to be very tough, that there was no such thing as a perfect agreement. And what we were aiming to do was to sharply constrain the Iranian program over a long period of time with very tight verification requirements, and then to phase in sanctions relief so that you'd preserve leverage over the Iranians and try to ensure that they lived up to their obligations. And I think, largely speaking, 2 years later, the agreement that was produced on the 14th of July is pretty close to the contours of what we thought might be possible when we started the secret talks.
And so as you hear the rhetoric on both sides, both those trying to sell it and those trying to kill it, and that's sort of defined by President Obama on one end and Chuck Schumer from his very own party, Senate Democratic leadership, on the other. Does the nature of the conversation about it reflect the realities of what the agreement does and does not do at both ends?
I think the first thing I'd say is that, there are risks involved in any option for dealing with the Iranian nuclear issue, and I think it's important to be honest about those. And as I said, we don't live in a perfect world. And, in a perfect world, You would ensure that the Iranians are never able to enrich nuclear material and that they dismantle all of the installations that they've built up over the years. The reality is, all of you know, we don't live in a perfect world. The Iranians developed the know-how to enrich material, and there's a fairly strong consensus within Iran, not just within the Iranian regime, in support of at least some form of domestic enrichment as a part of their nuclear program. So you can't wish that away, you can't dismantle it away, you can't bomb it away, that know-how, nor can you build an international consensus of the sort that we built that brought such economic pressure on Iran around the notion of zero enrichment. What you could do is build a strong international consensus around a sharply constrained program. And I think that's just the reality that we sought to put into practice in the agreement that was eventually reached. And I think you have to ask yourself the basic question: if the United States were to walk away from the agreement that's been reached now, could we produce a better deal? And my own honest view, and I understand all the concerns, quite legitimate concerns and questions that many thoughtful people raise about this deal, and I think it's important not to be dismissive of those concerns at all. But I think if you look at this carefully, it's very difficult for me to see how, if we walked away, not only couldn't we produce a better deal, but I think we'd end up in worse strategic circumstances because we'd be the isolated party. Our partners, our principal European allies, not to mention the Russians and Chinese, would accuse us of bad faith. The sanctions that have been built up so painstakingly, I think, would begin to erode. And it's the Iranians who would position themselves as the aggrieved party in all this, and they would still have the option of resuming a lot of the nuclear work that we managed to freeze in the interim agreement and roll back, and that would be sharply constrained under the comprehensive agreement. So I do not mean to suggest that this is a perfect agreement. It's not. And honest people can have real concerns about it, but I do believe it's the best of the available alternatives in 2015 for ensuring that the Iranians do not acquire a nuclear weapon and to deter them from trying to do that in the future.
So, Bill, we've spent some time, you and I, talking about how one might encase the Iran agreement in a broader regional understanding of what you would do to contain Iran's power. If you listen to the arguments that the opponents are making, they're saying, well, as soon as you unfreeze the sanctions, which were only intended as a way to bring the Iranians to the table, you will also give them money to spend on Hezbollah and other forms of terrorism and so forth. And clearly there's going to be a problem with an empowered Iran. So how would you, if you were advising the president right now, both on how to sell the deal, but also how to situate the deal in a changed Middle East, what would you tell him?
Well, I think first, I have never assumed that a nuclear agreement would produce an overnight transformation of Iranian behavior, whether it's their support for Hezbollah or in Syria, or for Shia militias in Iraq, or the Houthis in Yemen. The reality is that the nuclear challenge is only one dimension of Iranian behavior that threatens not only American interests, but the interests of our allies and partners across large parts of the Middle East. So I think that two things that are critical, if the nuclear agreement and when I hope it goes into force, the two things that are critical are first to ensure the most rigorous possible implementation of the agreement, which is not going to be an easy challenge. This is a complicated agreement, and it's going to require the kind of oversight and focus that, to be honest, the US government is not always great at. It's going to require additional support for the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is charged with, the actual inspection and verification related to the agreement. So that's going to be important. And then the second big challenge, as David suggested, is to embed this agreement in a more effective, wider strategy in the region, which recognizes in a clear-eyed way the threats that Iran can pose in other parts of the Middle East, reassures our allies and partners, whether it's Israel or in the Gulf, that we understand the importance of pushing back against that behavior and making use of the tools that we still have at our disposal, UN Security Council resolutions that bar Iran from providing weapons to Hezbollah or to the Houthis or others, and actually make use of those instruments to interdict the flow of arms and interdict the flow of money in that direction. Now, that's easy to say and hard to do, but I think those two things, rigorous execution and embedding the agreement in, an effective wider strategy are both going to be critically important. Both of those require strong American leadership. There's a tendency when an agreement gets done to think that's the end of the process. The truth is, this is just the beginning of a new and very complicated phase in dealing with Iran and Iranian behavior that I think for some time to come is still going to be a considerable challenge. The only thing I would add is that amidst the chaos of the Middle East, ensuring that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon and that it doesn't have an unconstrained nuclear program is extremely important, because if it had either of those things, it would add yet another layer of fragility to an already chaotic region.
When you think about the region these days, there's great debate underway about whether an unconstrained Iran or ISIS forms a greater threat to us. And one of the oddities here is that the Iranians are on roughly the same side of the fight as the United States in dealing with ISIS. As you think about this, how do you integrate the ISIS element of this? Is there an opportunity to work with Iran post-nuclear agreement in combating ISIS, or do we do this in separate, uncoordinated steps? And how real is the ISIS threat to your mind?
I think the ISIS threat is quite real. And I think if you take a step back and you look at the Middle East today, what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is the crumbling of much of the old Arab state system, whether it's in Libya, Syria, Iraq today, or in Yemen. And there's a big question mark hanging over the vacuum that's been created. And the question is, what comes next? ISIS has its own view of what should come next, using a kind of extremely brutal 8th century playbook. Iran has its own version of what comes next and is very opportunistic in taking advantage of that chaos and the vacuum. There are authoritarian Arab regimes that have their own view of what should come next. And I think over the long term, that's a question that only Arab leaders and Arab peoples can answer. Is there room for pluralism in the Arab world? Is there room for a kind of tolerance that allows for different sects and ethnic groups to live together in one state? Or is it a region that's condemned to just retreat behind tribes and sects, and where it's very hard to put together a diverse state? But there are things that the United States, I think, and American leadership can do in the meantime, and a large part of that is going to be to push back against ISIS. In Iraq, that involves a political security strategy, because security means alone are not going to defeat ISIS in Iraq. If the Iraqi security forces can retake a big city like Ramadi or Mosul, but if you don't have an answer for the question politically, what comes the next day? Is there a credible Sunni Arab leadership the next day? You're going to see a repetition of this problem for months and months and years to come. So, and in Syria, it's just difficult for me to see how you marginalize, let alone defeat ISIS, unless you can produce a transition of leadership in Damascus away from the Assad regime, so that you can mobilize the majority of the Sunni population as well as what's left of the state structures against ISIS. That's a big challenge, not only for American diplomacy, but it's going to require some leverage on the ground as well. I don't know whether the Iranian nuclear agreement creates opportunities with regard to Syria. I'm skeptical in the short run, because I've found over the years that both the Russians and Iranians are quite unsentimental in their view of the situation in the Middle East. They don't need to be persuaded that Bashar al-Assad may not be a smart long-term bet, but what they want is an answer to the second question: what's the alternative, and does that protect their core interests as they see them? But I think we may be in a position where at least we have the opportunity to talk directly to all the principal players, but we're going to have to build up some leverage on the ground and make some progress against ISIS to create the conditions to, in a sense, enable a more serious diplomatic effort.
Bill, for all the years I've known you, you do foreign politics, but not domestic politics. But since we've turned to ISIS and Iran, let me just ask you one domestic political question, because your answers on both these issues have been a lot more subtle than what we're hearing on the campaign trail. And I would say from both parties, actually. Not surprising. But if you're a Republican candidate these days, and since there are so many of them, maybe we would start with them. And you have to take up these issues. You have a very difficult needle to sort of thread here, because on the one hand, the consistent theme we've heard is America's got to lead, it's got to be stronger, we're not as respected in the world as we need to be, if only we stood up to ISIS, Iran, whatever. I think all the Republican candidates, if I think I have this right, have advocated walking away from the Iran agreement. Many of them have argued in favor of some gradation of stronger action against ISIS. On the other hand, we have an American population that's pretty tired of war after what is now 14 years of it, post 9/11. So just describe the problem here and how the politics of this intersects with the diplomacy of this.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we live in a moment as the United States looks at the rest of the world that's complicated. I mean, as David suggested, the last 14 years or so since 9/11 have been a rough period in many respects. 2 long, costly, protracted wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a transformative global financial crisis where lots of Americans are still feeling the effects of that, the rise of ISIS in a Middle East that seems to be coming apart at the seams. So it's natural for Americans, for all of us, I think, to feel not only tired of engagement for the rest of the world, but to buy in sometimes to the narratives that you see all around us about the decline of the United States. Now, the truth is, I'm an optimist at heart about the United States, and if you take a step back, the United States really still is the first among unequals in the world. I mean, by almost any measure of power, as you look out over the next several decades, we're still playing a relatively strong hand. Not just the strength of the American military, the resilience of the American economy, the fact that the global energy revolution have put the United States right at the center of that, demography, we're still a relatively younger and more mobile population if we ever get immigration reform right than most of our peer competitors around the world. Geography, our 2 liquid assets, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, that shield us from a lot of the pressures that other major powers in the world face. The question is, we have a moment before us, a kind of window, I think looking out over the next several decades, where we have an opportunity to shape events in the world, at least to play a leading role in that through American leadership, before they get shaped for us, whether it's by the rise of other powers or of other trends and other events. And so I think as you look at the Middle East, as complicated as it is, part of the challenge in looking back over the last 14 or 15 years is I think there's been a tendency in America's dealings with the world to kind of, as you look at the toolbox for the United States, to prioritize military instruments. So the first temptation sometimes is to use force precisely because we have such a strong military. And then diplomacy is kind of what you do either to facilitate that or to deal with the aftermath of it. And I think what you've seen in recent years anyway, what President Obama has tried to do, is to focus on the use of diplomacy backed up by the threat of force, backed up by the economic leverage that the United States can bring to bear, as a way of demonstrating American leadership. And so to answer the question about threading the needle, I think one of the big challenges for the United States as we look out over the next few years beyond this election cycle is going to be not only to rebalance the way in which we apply American strength across the world. Obviously, the Asia-Pacific deserves a lot more attention, but also to rebalance the kind of tools that we bring to bear so that we keep very much in mind the strength of the American military and the reality that sometimes we're going to have to use force, but also to try to take as much advantage as we can of diplomacy that's backed up by the threat of the use of force as well.
So you hinted there at the big question of priorities. So President Obama came into office saying it was time for rebalancing, that we were overinvested in the Middle East. If the world was a giant portfolio, we would say we were significantly underinvested in Asia. And obviously that appeals to a lot of American voters and the instinctual understanding that whatever you can get accomplished in Asia can lead to America's economic strength and revival. And it's hard to make that argument in the Middle East, really hard. We may have to be there, but we're not necessarily there for any economic reasons. And in fact, fracking and the like has probably reduced our economic interest in the Middle East. How would you grade how the United States has brought about that rebalancing in the Obama years?
I mean, I think it's a work in progress. I agree entirely with the priority that's attached to the Asia Pacific. It really is the center of gravity in the global economic system. And increasingly, given the rise of China, which I think is the single most consequential bilateral relationship that we have in the world, it's obviously going to be of central importance for many years to come. So I think the challenge, as is always the case with a significant shift in American foreign policy, is how do you follow through on that, not just with one speech, but over a period of months and years of demonstrating not just our military commitment in the Asia Pacific, but our diplomatic presence, our economic engagement, look at ways in which we can restructure institutions in the Asia Pacific to reflect the kind of standards we want to see in trade and investment relationships. So it's a lot of hard work, but I think the honest answer is it's a work in progress, and it's going to need a lot more focus and attention.
Will it need a lot more resources? I mean, for all that we heard from President Obama about doing the pivot, the concept was that we would reduce both our military engagement and, while perhaps not our diplomatic engagement, but our focus, the sort of headspace of our leadership on the Middle East, and put more of that into Asia. When you go to Asia these days, and I, having served in Tokyo Bureau Chief for a good number of years, I'm there periodically. What I hear from my Asian friends is, we heard the speech, where are you guys? Every time we turn around and open up the newspapers, you're starting a new effort in Iraq. Your Secretary of State is spending 3 weeks in Vienna negotiating the Iran agreement. Not that I'm complaining. I was there for 3 weeks myself and didn't get much sympathy from my co-workers for having been stuck there. But they wonder, is this more than a series of speeches? How do you convince them that it is?
I mean, I think you only convince people through actions and through the application of, American diplomatic focus for, years to come. The truth is the Middle East has a kind of nasty addictive effect on people sometimes, and it's difficult to neglect it. It's difficult to pivot away from it. We have important transatlantic relationships too. There's been a certain amount of kind of pivot envy in Europe in recent years as, we focused more attention both rhetorically and practically on the Asia Pacific. But as, Putin's resurgence and the Ukraine crisis demonstrates, we don't have the luxury of ignoring Russia, Europe, Eurasia either. So it's always a complicated balancing act, and I'd be the first to acknowledge that there's more that we need to do to give substance to the rebalance to the Asia Pacific. But I think it's going to remain a central priority, not just for the rest of this administration, but for the next one as well.
Well, you mentioned Putin, and I want to come back to that in a minute, but while we're on Asia, let me just turn for a moment to your views on China. Before we get to the events of the week, the devaluation of the currency and so forth, let me ask you a little bit about Xi Jinping. Probably the most fascinating Chinese leader we've seen, at least since Deng Xiaoping and perhaps since Mao. Far more control over the country than we anticipated. Far more assertive in grabbing territorial rights than we thought. For 2 years, President Obama has been talking to him about abating the constant cyber attacks on the United States. Instead, we have OPM and all of your records and everybody else who's got a security clearance in Chinese hands now. Did we get Xi Jinping wrong? Did we not understand where he was taking the country?
No, I don't think it's so much getting Xi Jinping wrong. I mean, he certainly has consolidated his authority faster than any Chinese leader in the last 40 years or so. But he faces a lot of pretty significant domestic challenges. I mean, not just pollution and corruption, obvious ones, but also the really complicated challenge of trying to move toward a different model of economic growth based more on domestic consumption. And that, as we've seen in recent weeks, as the Chinese leadership has wrestled with the stock market and devaluation, is a lot easier said than done. So it's not so much, I think, that we got it wrong as that, China's in, a complicated period in which its rise is enormously significant. Its influence is obviously growing, not just in the Asia Pacific, but around the world. But at the same time, it faces a lot of really complicated domestic challenges. And finding a way to navigate through all that, I think, is going to be a real test of Xi Jinping's leadership. And I think the state visit that he's going to make to Washington and to the U.S. in about a month is going to be a really significant moment for the U.S.-China relationship.
Journalistic colleague of mine once put it, I thought, so well during times that we were in China. He said, the remarkable thing about covering China for the past 25 years is you felt like you were on a giant river raft, and there were all these boulders that got thrown up, and they managed to skirt around or over every one. In the past few weeks, particularly in the past few days when we've seen the devaluation, have they finally hit that economic boulder that we've been wondering about?
I mean, it's a pretty big stone if it's not a boulder, and it is a reminder of the very complicated terrain that the Chinese leadership has to navigate right now. Like you, David, I've found the Chinese leadership pretty agile in the past about figuring out a way through that, but I wouldn't underestimate how formidable some of the challenges are right now.
Especially because the economic deal has always been the political deal. I mean, the Communist Party in China is not in power today because the Chinese people love its ideology. They are in power today because the Chinese people love their 8% growth. And when that growth goes away, you have to wonder what the rest of the society, how it reacts.
No, you do, and you have a middle class that's rising in China. You can build all the great firewalls you want, but you can't, insulate a rising middle class in the information technology revolution age from the realities of corruption and pollution and the sorts of things that Chinese citizens get understandably concerned about. So that's not an easy challenge for any Chinese leadership to try to navigate right now. And you look at other difficult issues. You mentioned cyber. I used to lead the U.S. side, and twice a year discussions with the Chinese about cyber issues, and it was amongst the most complicated discussions I was ever a part of, because it was really kind of a dialogue of the deaf sometimes. And it's only, I think, when Chinese society begins to develop its own self-interest in protecting intellectual property and reining in the cybersphere that you're likely to see much progress.
And when you think about those discussions, and then you think about the OPM theft, which on the one hand was classic espionage. I mean, had the Chinese gone to grab the records of 150 people who worked in the American embassy in Beijing, you wouldn't have been shocked. But 22 million Americans what do you see as the goal there?
And I take that personally too, because I assume my records were there as well. No, the scale of
By the way, they just called to say you missed a line on your tax returns this year. I think it was 32. You might want to look at it.
Yeah, I'll be more careful next time. No, I think it's the scale, just as you mentioned, that's really stunning in this. And we've gone after the Chinese hammer and tongs over the issue of cyber-enabled commercial espionage. But this is kind of new territory when this is more traditional kind, or appears to be more traditional kind of espionage, but on a scale that I think is a reminder of the power of cyber tools today. And we're just starting to scratch the surface, not just with the Chinese, but with lots of others around the world, about trying to develop rules of the road for dealing with these kind of issues. We wrestled with the same kind of things in the nuclear field 60 years ago when you had this huge transformative development in nuclear energy, but no real international rules of the road for dealing with it. And that's the challenge before us now. The big difference, of course, is in the nuclear field, that was the preserve of governments. Now, when you talk about the cyber field, you're not just talking about governments, you're talking about all sorts of non-state actors as well. So it's infinitely more difficult to develop those rules.
Yeah, it's negotiating with governments, criminals, teenagers. As I said to you earlier, teenagers in my house don't sign treaties, so a harder task. So a last topic before we open this up to everybody else. I'm sure there is a medal somewhere in the State Department for people who have to spend hours on end negotiating with Vladimir Putin. If so, you're a multiple-time recipient. So tell us what you learned about him during your time as ambassador, and tell us how that informs your understanding of what he's trying to get done in Ukraine the vaguer threats to the NATO allies in the Balkans and so forth.
Yeah, nice, easy topic. I mean, you know, Putin, in my experience, is a like much of the Russian political elite now, is a combustible combination of insecurity and grievance and aggressiveness. And there's a sense of grievance that Putin puts in its most pugnacious form, but which is shared by lots of Russians I know, including a lot of, you know, sharp critics of Putin, that holds that the history of the last 20 or 25 years is a narrative of the West taking advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness. Now, I don't accept that argument. I don't think we should indulge it, but you kind of have to understand it anyway to understand Russian behavior in Ukraine in particular, which is the rawest nerve for Russians, because it's very difficult for most Russians I know, in the political elite and outside of it, to see Russia, to see themselves as a major power without a deferential government in Ukraine. So that's one reality, again, whether we accept or indulge that or not. A second is that, you know, Putin, up through his second term as president, when I was ambassador there, 2005 to 2008, had established a basic kind of social contract with people, which was, you stay out of politics, and I will ensure in return rising economic growth rates, rising living standards. That worked pretty well.
How Chinese of him.
Right.
Yeah.
It's similar to a lot of authoritarian regimes. But that worked fine when he was surfing on $100 a barrel oil. Oil prices came down because of corruption and a failure to diversify the economy started to stagnate. That old social contract broke down. So he had to find a new kind of social contract, and what came most naturally to him as a product of his professional training for many years was a very nasty form of nationalism and chauvinism, a kind of us versus them mentality, not only in Russia's dealing with the outside world, a kind of suspicion that, you know, everything since the Orange Revolution in Ukraine a decade ago was aimed at regime change in the Kremlin, but also an us versus them attitude at home, this suspicion that's, you know, kind of fomented by the Kremlin about fifth columnists, you know, creates an atmosphere in which one of the leading oppositionists in Russia, Boris Nemtsov, can be murdered 200 meters from the Kremlin walls. And I'm not saying that Putin directed that, but there's an atmosphere created that I think is, you know, very counterproductive for Russia. So, you know, that's the kind of world I think that, you know, all of us are going to be dealing with. We don't have the luxury of ignoring Russia. Even a weakening Russia can be a very disruptive force. And people look at all the vulnerabilities that Russia has today. The fact that it's a one-dimensional economy dependent on hydrocarbons. Corruption is a huge problem. Demography is a huge problem, especially when you remember that there are only 35 million Russians living in the vast expanse of the earth that runs from the Ural Mountains across all of Siberia to the Russian Far East, sitting on just about everything in the periodic table of elements and looking across a very long border at 1.3 billion Chinese. So there's a reason for that insecurity sometimes. But on the other side of the coin, Russia is still a formidable player. You know, still a permanent member of the UN Security Council, still the only nuclear power in the world comparable to the United States, still sitting on a lot of hydrocarbons. So, you know, it's important to engage the Russian leadership to push back on Ukraine and in lots of areas where Russian behavior creates real problems for us and for our allies and for stability in Europe, but also to find ways in which we try to preserve what cold-bloodedly are still some important parts of that relationship, on nuclear proliferation, negotiations with Iran or North Korea, the kinds of things that I think are going to matter in a hard-nosed way to both of us.
A last question before we open it up. Bill, you started your career when the Cold War was still at its height. The middle third was this period of sort of American unilateral power, if you think back during the Clinton administration. We didn't sort of view it that way at the time. When we look back, really unchallenged by China, Russia, or the degree of chaos. The Middle East was still stable, if simmering. And then in your last 10 years, 12 years in office, dealing with the chaos and disorder that got unleashed after 9/11 and the Iraq War. Which is harder to manage? The Cold War tensions where it seemed to be so much at stake and one mistake would end it for all of us, or this disorder period where the threats are more amorphous, but you're dealing with far more actors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question. I mean, I, again, think back to the beginning of my career when there were truly existential threats to the United States, and that's a term that gets thrown around a little too lightly. But at the height of the Cold War, there was really a danger of nuclear confrontation of the sort that could have obliterated both the Soviet Union and the United States and lots of neighbors all around. But the current period, I think, which is, you know, in some ways not as dangerous as that, because you don't face that same existential threat, but a lot more complicated because you have an international landscape in which power is a lot more diffuse than it was at the height of the Cold War. It's diffuse among states with the rise of China and India as global powers, big regional powers like Brazil and Turkey and Indonesia. It's diffuse within states because of the rise of middle classes, hundreds of millions of people around the world, especially China and India. Information technology revolution, those two things have empowered individuals to challenge leaderships in, you know, ways which complicate the kind of world in which we live. And it's also, power is also more diffuse beyond states. So you have lots of non-state actors today, from the very benign, like the Gates Foundation, to the very malign, like ISIS and other players. So it's, you know, the business of diplomacy is not just about managing relations between governments, it's about engaging whole societies. And so in that sense, this is a lot more complicated period. It doesn't lend itself to sort of bumper sticker slogans like containment, you know, during the Cold War. But it's a world in which I think American leadership, even though it has to be applied in different ways, is, as I was saying before, as crucial as ever. Because people, whether we like it or not, still look to us to help make sense of a very complicated world and to try to mobilize coalitions to deal with the most complicated problems before us.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. We could keep doing this all night. We could keep doing this all night, and some nights we have. But we're not going to inflict that on everybody today, but we are going to take your questions, and so.
Might I just remind you, by the way, watching two professionals at the top of their game, you only get great answers from great questions. So please, let's have your great questions now. Can I just add this point? If you're going to ask a question, most people tend to make a long preliminary statement, followed by a very short question. I would suggest dropping the statement and asking the question. There are microphones everywhere. Who's going to be first? Somebody here. Gentleman down there. Can somebody get a microphone to this man here?
Thanks for a great presentation. For those of us, and I'll try and abide by your suggestion of a short opening statement, but for those of us who've read the bulk of the public disclosure on the Iranian negotiations, there appeared to be an asymmetry in what we gave up versus what we were told at the time that the first disclosures of commentary, you know, the anytime, anywhere examples. And so my question is not so much about that as it is about the tension between the State Department and a president at the end of his second term who is moving ever so close to a legacy-defining moment. And after your great and long career, where's the balance of that tension? And is the criticism of the president and our asymmetric give-up something that you agree with or disagree with?
I mean, I guess all I would say, and David may want to add to this, is that, you know, as I said at the start, I've always believed that the best way to approach the Iranian nuclear issue is in a kind of very sober, pragmatic way. We don't live in a perfect world. This isn't a perfect agreement, and I don't believe a perfect agreement is possible. I think the balance of what we gave up and we got in return is a reasonable one, in my view. I think this is the best of the available alternatives. to ensure that Iran doesn't acquire a nuclear weapon and that we can deter them from doing that. Now, having said that, I think it's really important to be straight about the fact that there are risks involved in this, that honest people can have real concerns about this issue, that this agreement has to be embedded in a wider strategy, as I mentioned before, that looks in a clear-eyed way at Iranian behavior that's going to threaten us and threaten our friends for some time to come in other parts of the Middle East. And it just seems to me that, you know, that's the most direct way of making the case. But I do think it's founded on an agreement that's better than the alternatives. And, you know, all too often in diplomacy, that's the reality that you have to deal with. Because I think on the Iranian nuclear issue, at least in my experience, if you look in the rearview mirror, there are lots of moments over the last 10 or 15 years in which what we might have had then looks a lot better now than it seemed at the time. And it's a history that's littered, I think, with missed opportunities on all sides. And I just think it's really important to try to take advantage of this one, imperfections and all.
I just add one short thing to that as somebody who's covered the Iranian nuclear program for longer than I'd want to think, but probably more than a decade now. The American history with the Iranian nuclear program has always been one of delaying it. It has never been one of having the fantasy of really shutting it down. There may have been that opportunity, as Bill suggested, relatively early in the Bush administration when the Iranians only had 164 centrifuges spinning, but that moment was past and we'll never see it again, I suspect. So if you think about the three things we've done to slow the program, one has been sanctions. That's the one everybody talks about. The second has been sabotage. That's the one I've written a lot about, including the cyber attacks on the Iranian program. And the third has been diplomacy. And if you think that Stuxnet bought us a year or two and sanctions may have bought us a number of years, this agreement gets you somewhere between 12 and 15 years before most of the restrictions or most of the leverage on Iran is lifted. So when Bill says you can't oversell it, I think what he's saying, correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth here, Bill, is this thing gives you 10 to 15 years. After that, it may not give you much, but we don't know what the world looks like after that.
And I think the reality is we still have a lot of levers to use if after 15 years Iran were to break its obligation, because it's still going to be under an obligation not to develop a nuclear weapon. And we would still have the tools, and in many ways would have even stronger tools at that time to deal with that and to deter it, more importantly.
Another question, please? Yes, gentleman here in front. Fourth row.
The short question.
Could you stand up? Could you stand up, please?
Yes. That's more difficult than asking the question. The short question is, in 23 days, what couldn't you remove from a military installation that could be found to be detrimental to the thrust of what the treaty was meant to achieve?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I know there have been a lot of questions raised about this 24-day period within which, you know, the IAEA could be sure to get access, its inspectors. The truth is, and David knows the science of this very well, if it's, you know, a violation that involves enriched material, you know, that can be discovered for a long period of time beyond 24 days. It's very difficult to conceal that. The reality is there are certain kinds of things connected to weaponization experiments, which, you know, the US intelligence community believes the Iranians stopped in 2003 and haven't resumed, that would be more difficult to, that it would be easier to try to conceal during that 24-day period. I mean, that's a reality that would have to deal with whether it was 2 days, 24 days, 48 days. We did build into the July 14th, the comprehensive agreement, restrictions on some kinds of, you know, potential weaponization activities, which I think are important, which haven't been contained in the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty before, which I think set an important precedent in dealing with other countries that might try to achieve nuclear weapons. And so that's, you know, a part of the answer to your question. But there's no perfect answer. You're right, in 24 days, there are certain kinds of things that you might be able to conceal. But what you could not conceal is anything, I think, connected to the use of enriched material.
Could we take one last question, please? Lady over there.
One of the things I've noticed, Bill, when you gave your discussion about the agreement and the reasons for it, very convincing, essentially the same substantively as what President Obama has said, but hugely different in the way you presented it. First of all, listening to President Obama, I'm horrified at how he insults people. He kind of implies you're stupid or your feelings are going to get hurt. And what you've said repeatedly is honest people can have different agreements. This isn't a perfect agreement. It's we don't stop from this point. I don't understand why President Obama does this. Is his personality? He's done it on other issues. And I've been on
Is that a question, may I ask?
Yes. But it's something that's important. And so I'd like to have your comment on that, because you seem to be very aware of that as an ambassador, maybe as
Can you
tax-
define the question more precisely, please?
Okay. Well, and honestly, I wanted to make a comment on this, and it was something I can't sit at something like this and not have an opinion, and I just think it's something very important, because as I listened to you, I thought you could get Congress, most of the Congress.
I
on
think
board.
you've made that point very effectively
Okay,
and
thank
repeatedly.
you.
If you have a question, we'd love to
No,
hear it. If not, we'll take
any
one last
comments?
question.
Thank
So,
you.
gentlemen here.
Thank you.
We inevitably focus on short-run discussions. When you go to bed at night and you think about your children, what are the issues that you think, what are the biggest foreign policy risks that you worry about looking forward, say, 10 years?
I mean, the honest answer is not one of the sort of geographic issues we've been talking about. It's climate. I really do believe that the phenomenon of climate change is something that really requires strong American leadership, and I think you've seen from this administration, especially over the last year, a focus on that. It's not easy to do. I mean, I sound like I was trying to answer the nuclear issue, but there are costs, especially in developing countries in terms of growth rates and everything else, and so you have to be mindful of that. But I really do believe, if you look at the reality that since 1950, sea levels around the world have risen by 5 inches, which is not an academic matter to the half of the human population that lives on or near seacoasts, the realities of climate change, I think, are ones we can't ignore. It's not impossible to deal with those. Progress in clean and renewable energies gives us a lot of possibilities to bring into balance the challenge of economic growth as well as climate change. But to answer your question, I mean, I think that's the big overarching issue alongside everything else we've been talking about that I think really calls for strong American leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Burns came here specially. Flew up from Washington on a ridiculously tight schedule. We promised we'd have him away by 10 minutes after 5. We're doing that. What a wonderful session. Thank you very much, both of you.